And I am Church,
We are
or
here,
sometimes called Churchmeister
Church
for shorts.
Meister, not Church Munger. You are Church Meister.
Churchmeister.
Yes. Episode 4.
So, yeah, I guess 4 since we did that. What did we call it? An overtime.
We did an overtime, which turned into the longest episode I think that we've had to date. So, episode 4 of The Jam. Welcome, everybody.
So, did you get much chance to do reading on this particular subject and any sort of research, or are you going to it a little bit cold today?
I am a little cold. I have some.
That'll make the conversation interesting.
Well, I have some thoughts based on things that you and I have talked about previously to this anyway. So,
well, I did a lot of reading and research on it, which is why I say it would be. I think it'll be interesting.
I remember you
be able to play kind of those ideas off each other. Today we're talking about empathy, and for a long time I've had this just kind of gut feeling about empathy that went something along the lines of this. I felt like empathy was stupid.
Okay.
That's overstating it. I don't really think empathy is stupid, but there was just something that felt wrong about empathy. Like this push for empathy, like empathy was so important and so needed, and the key to like saving the world was all about empathy. And there's been this long time push towards that sort of thinking. It's become very, very popular and very trendy to talk about empathy, and empathy being like, you know, the big important thing that we all need to develop, and that would somehow solve all our problems. And it just always felt kind of wrong to me, but I hadn't bothered to really articulate it too much. I had a few discussions here and there on some discussion forums, but they didn't really go very far because I hadn't really made my thoughts very concrete. So I think I've put enough thought into it now that I think I can express my view on it. And I know it's going to be a little controversial as far as it's not common thinking, but I think common thinking is problematic. So hopefully that's a good thing. But I also then did come across a source that basically agreed with everything that I thought and helped me to sort of bring my thoughts together.
Who is the source?
So
who is the source?
I have the link in our notes here. It's to the Amazon book. The book's called Against Empathy: The Case for Rational Compassion. And it is by, I should have had the link up before I started reading it. It is by Paul Bloom, who is a psychology professor at Yale, I believe. And so, Against Empathy: The Case for Rational Compassion. And I haven't read the book because I just found it in my research in the last about day. But I did listen to a podcast, essentially, where he was being interviewed about it and talked about some of his ideas. So I can't comment fully on the book, but I do understand the premise of it and what he's getting at. But before we get started, one of the biggest things that I think has been problematic, even when I've had discussions about empathy with other people, is when we're talking about what empathy actually is. And that becomes problematic because everybody sort of has their own idea of what empathy means, and it doesn't align. And so people talk past each other all the time because they think, you know, they're talking about one thing and another person is thinking something else. So how would you define empathy?
Okay, well, I don't have to define empathy. I have a great thing called the dictionary. Yes, that is actually what we used to use when we wanted to define a term. The meaning of empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings and thoughts of others, past or present. And this is where I think my personal definition of empathy would slightly differ to that. from that.
Okay, that's good to know because mine aligns with that. My understanding of what empathy
Okay, but there were key words in there though that I am not particularly. I don't agree with the way they describe it, and let me just go through it really quick. The action of understanding, that's empathy. That's not sympathy. That's empathy. Being aware of or sensitive to, that I think it is where it becomes clouded. So in empathy, when you try to empathize with other people, you want to try to understand what they are, what their feelings are, where they're coming from, why they are feeling that way. And obviously that means that you have to have some sort of sensitivity to it. You can't just be cold. You want to be understanding and listening. And if you're not sensitive to another person's feelings, if a person is really upset or very sad, you want to try to understand that. You want to be sensitive to it. But if you're cold, then obviously you are not going to be able to exercise empathy for that person's situation. However, being sensitive to, I think that's where it's very convoluted today, because people listen to that part of it, or they might think that in order to be sensitive to someone's feelings or their thoughts, that they have to share those feelings or thoughts. And that's the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy, one of the definitions of sympathy is that you have a common feeling. You have an understanding between people. You share. Ooh, there's some good thunder going on right there. You hear that?
Yeah, I heard that.
So you have a common feeling, and then.
See, and I don't agree with that. I don't think that I see sympathy in those terms. So I'll get to that in a second. No.
Well, see, but again, we're looking at the definition, the real definition, versus what other people assume empathy is. I think.
Well, did you? I didn't look up the dictionary definition of sympathy. Did you?
Yeah, that's what I just read. That's what I just read. Is that having a?
Well, you read empathy.
No, I read that sympathy is an understanding between people, and you have common feelings.
Okay, all right.
So feelings of, now sympathy is also feelings of pity and sorrow.
See, I don't agree with that definition.
Well,
that's interesting.
Yeah, feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune. So when somebody has misfortune happen to them, like let's say that you hear on the news that someone's child has been seriously hurt or worse. You have feelings of pity towards that person. You're very sad for that person. I am anyway, especially when it comes to children.
Okay.
When I hear,
all right, I can accept that, and maybe what I'm looking at is the word that I'm looking at, maybe is compassion, because what I'm thinking is you could choose to behave compassionately and have compassionate feelings for someone without actually experiencing the feeling that they're feeling.
But that's empathy.
See, that I don't know that it is. I mean, once again, like I said, the definition is all over the place. But that is not, I'll guarantee you, that is not the common understanding of empathy. When people talk about being empathetic with others, they're not talking about that.
No, they want you to agree.
They're talking about feeling what they're feeling.
And agreeing with what they're feeling.
Understanding and agreeing with is sort of implicit. I think you're right.
It is implicit, but when you look at if you look at especially the rainbow movement, there is extreme rhetoric by some, not all. By some, actually, it's a small percentage, but they are the most vocal percentage. That in order to empathize with them, you have to agree with them. And while I empathize with their desire to be accepted in society, I think it's well established they are accepted in society. I think that individuals will have a hard time with it, but the guilt that they make other people feel for not agreeing, that's they're guilting people into agreeing with them.
Right. Yeah, and I think the problem with empathy and this is the way that I should keep his name up because I spaced the name the moment I am done saying it. Paul Bloom, the author of Against Empathy, his argument
Orlando's
stems
brother.
His argument stems from the idea that he's not actually. I think the title of the book is purposefully a little bit hyperbolic. I don't think that he's actually fully 100% against empathy. What he's against is using empathy as a moral compass. And so that when you're using your feelings towards any given thing as the compass by whether you judge an action related to that as the moral action or not, that's where you get into trouble. And I absolutely agree with that. One of the examples he uses with that is he talks about how we see these commercials for like lost or starving or hungry or hurt animals, right? And then our hearts go out to these animals and we want to help.
Do you have a problem with animals?
We donate
What's the
to
matter
causes
with
or
animals?
something. So the problem with it
After Henry died, are you an animal hater?
The problem is we are biased towards cute animals.
Henry was his
So
dog,
we
for those just tuning in for the first time.
For those who didn't catch our last
Henrietta, that
episode.
was the name of their dog.
Henrietta, yeah. We're biased towards cute animals. And so we see these causes that are, save the dolphins and save the panda and save the cute animal. But then there are animals that are terrible looking, but are wonderful for the earth and should and need to be saved and need to be protected. I don't have a specific example, but for example, say that you had a spider shortage, and the spider's existence was causing other bugs to overrun the planet, and so you needed to save the spiders. It would be a lot harder to get people behind a Save the Spider campaign because spiders are creepy and scary. And so empathy is problematic because people are biased, and if they're and your feelings about any given thing don't mean that thing are good or bad. So using your empathy and the way that you feel about something to make judgments about how you interact with those things has a tendency to cause tribalism. It has a tendency to that you relate to people who are like you, to things that you find attractive, to things that you care about, and then you put your moral imperative towards those things rather than being actually truly equitable and just in your sense of right and wrong and in the way that you apply morality.
Equitable. What do you mean by equitable?
So equitable in morality is what I'm talking about. So in the way that you fight for what is right, and when you're fighting for right, that you're doing that based on say all humanity, what's right for humanity, instead of fighting for the causes that you feel.
Well, equitable is equal outcome. So how is?
No, we're getting into semantics again. That's not what.
But that is the modern day term for it. Equitable is equal.
Yeah, but the point is, I'm talking about that if you are. So another example. Let me give you an example that Paul Bloom used. Should probably call him Professor Bloom or something. Show him some respect. Not call him Paul. We're not. I don't know him.
He's not the apostle. He's not the apostle.
Polly boy. Yeah.
Hey, Polly.
You see these examples where they run tests on this, and they give everybody a colored bracelet or whatever, and then they start abusing. Not really abusing, but just like calling names or something.
Because they empathize. They empathize with each other.
And they start empathizing with the people that have the same color bracelets that they do. And it naturally leads to tribalism. You see the same thing with sports teams. And you see people, the people who vote for a different sports team, you don't empathize with them. And
they root.
You're natural.
You root
and it
for
creates
a sports
this natural
team. You
tribalism.
don't vote for a sports team.
Did I say vote?
You said vote.
Shows you how into sports I am. No, I just misspoke.
Yeah, So that's it's interesting that you bring up the colored bracelets, because that's similar, of course, to the Dr. Seuss book where they all had the stars on their bellies. And
right. Another example, yeah, that's a great example. Another example that he used, though, of how empathy can be taken advantage of is he talked about beggars in India. And so you go to India, and the beggars are everywhere, right? I've been to India, so I'm personally familiar with this. And
I
yeah,
have not
it
been
breaks
to
your
India.
heart.
So when you say right, I'm supposed to say, of course, because
you just
obviously
agree, yeah.
I've been
Yeah,
there.
well, you should know anyway, because it should. I expect that's moderately common knowledge, right? But anyway, yeah, it breaks your heart. Like, I remember having serious empathy towards some of these beggars, like serious empathy. And they use cute little children, these darling little children that look like they're starving to death, asking for money and stuff. And so potentially you're going to pull out your wallet and give money to these poor children because your heart goes out to them, right? Well, it turns out that they're run by con artists in a lot of cases. I don't know what the statistics are on that and stuff, but it's big business. And they get these kids and they send these kids out, and they're conning people out of their money, and they use these kids, and they use the disabled, and they use people like that. So by putting money into it, you're actually paying money into the coffers of criminals instead of helping these children out.
So I think,
and so
I think that's very similar to what happens here. I
agree.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people will use their,
and it happens across the board. It's not just in beggar. It happens in politics big time, right?
Yes.
Like politics plays on empathy, and that actually is politicking, is you go out and you play on people's empathy to get you to vote for them. And if that's why people are voting is just because of empathy rather than rationally stepping back and looking at the situation factually and making a moral choice based on compassionate, as he puts it, rational compassion, then it runs the risk of leading to some bad situations.
Okay.
And things.
So I had this discussion with my son the other day that we were actually talking a little bit about sympathy versus empathy, and one of the things that I felt at the time, this Paul Bloom says that empathy, it should be rational compassion, and I agree with that. I think that.
Well, he actually says that rational compassion is different than empathy. You shouldn't use empathy. You should use rational compassion.
But the definition or the intention of empathy, if you are to empathize with someone, it helps them to understand whether or not you are sincere. So if somebody does not think that you understand what they are going through, that you cannot try to relate what they are going through, the level of trust between people is going to break down. You're not going to have that. So you can't establish the common ground.
Perhaps.
You can't establish a common ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think
so rational,
I think he even said this.
Rational,
but
let me finish there. Here, rational compassion is what I would assume to be the close definition of what empathy is supposed to be. We should have empathy toward other people, in that we can try to relate in order to be sincere about the way that we approach and communicate with them. If we have a strong moral compass, then our own morality will not be compromised. With the people that you're talking about, people who just go along to get along, so they decide they want to be part of some group and then they start to shun other groups, they don't have a strong moral compass. So that does break down, and that's why effective communication doesn't exist between radical groups.
So I take the position, and Paul Bloom took this position as well, that empathy, and I think I stated this earlier, empathy he's not actually fully against empathy, and neither am I. What you're talking about is a situation where I think you're absolutely right. Like in a marriage, for example, like if you don't empathize with your wife at all, that's a problem. And even when there's situations that, rationally speaking, the empathetic choice wouldn't be the right choice, in your marriage you better make the empathetic choice anyway. And I'll give you an example that I thought about. Have you ever seen
empathy doesn't make a choice. That doesn't cause you to make a choice. It helps you to understand.
Right. Let me talk about sorry, I stated that wrong, but let me express this this point, and I think you'll get what I'm getting at. Have you seen the "It's Not About the Nail" video?
Yep, love that video.
So, for those who haven't seen it, there's it shows part of a woman's face, and she's talking about, I just have this pressure in my head. It's causing me so much trauma, and I just and she's complaining about this, and then she turns and she's got a nail sitting in her head, and it shows her husband sitting there looking at her, and he's like, "You have a nail in your head," and she says, "It's not about the nail." And then he's like, okay, I'm sorry. And then she says, "You always do this. I just need you to listen." And then she goes on and talks about, I can't sleep at night, and I keep getting snags in my sweaters. and he's like, but the nail. See, you're doing it again. It's not about the nail.
And then finally, he says, he listens to her, and she's talking about the pain, and he says, "That must be awful." And she says, "Yes, it is." And she's so thankful that he's finally listening.
Yeah. And so, from a practical point of view, like if someone had a nail in their head and it was causing them pain, and you could pull it out without, making them bleed to death, the practical choice would be to go physically force them and pull the nail out, and not worry about the fact that they hated you for the rest of your life because you didn't listen to them and you did something that they actually didn't want you to do. Even if a year later they realized their life was better, you'd end up divorced because you treated your wife that way. And so it might be the rational choice overall to, in that case, just do what she's asking for the empathetic understanding, to just understand that she's hurting, and to not actually propose the solution, not do the rational thing and say, "I don't care how you think you're feeling, you're wrong. There's a nail in your head and I'm pulling it out, and I don't care." That's not always going to be the rational choice, is to deal with things that way. But yeah. Anyway, so
So it kind of, I think that the good way to describe empathy, and you and I have had this discussion before, is that I do think that empathy, when you have a good moral compass and when used in a righteous manner, is most closely aligned with charity. Charity is the pure love of Christ, being able to have that pure understanding and pure love for other people in your heart, so that when you are interacting with anybody, whether it's serving them, whether it is just communicating with them, whether it's working with other people, it is really what sets the foundation of how you interact with other people. So when you have empathy, you can have empathy more than just with people other than your wife. You have empathy with people that you work with. You can have empathy with for people that you maybe go to school with. A teacher has to have empathy for his or her students.
I don't think what you're talking about is empathy, and I don't think it's required.
Well,
like I'm not saying no empathy.
But charity is good. Charity is.
Yeah, but charity does not require empathy.
So if you cannot understand a person's point of view, how are you going to have any sort of common ground?
Why do you have to have common ground? To treat them Christ-like, to treat them in a Christ-like manner.
How are they going to know? How are they going to know that you're sincere?
That's a different issue. I'm not saying that empathy has no place. I'm just saying that in order to love someone, in order to serve someone, in order to help someone, you don't have to understand their view of the matter. You don't have to understand their emotions on the matter. It can be helpful, and I'm not saying there's no value to it whatsoever. I'm just saying it's not requisite. Now,
is a therapist required to have empathy then? Not required?
A therapist is absolutely a specialized situation.
So if you have children,
I don't know that. I don't think that a therapist's empathy.
Do you not have empathy for your children?
Just absolutely not for everything. Nor should I. It would be stupid of me. It would be ridiculous of me to use empathy as my guiding principle.
But you're thinking that means unconditional empathy for every situation. Because
children's emotions are irrational.
But you're talking about, but we're talking about children. But what you're saying, I think what you're saying is that you don't think that empathy is required in every situation. Is that right?
I don't think it's required. I don't think it's good in every situation. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to have empathy in all situations.
So,
nor do I think we should have empathy in all situations. We talked about this before too, but I'll bring it up again. So, and I was studying this from a Christian, and specifically from a Latter-day Saint, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint point of view, because that's the church that you and I belong to. And so I was studying it, and it was talking about Christ-like empathy. It was talking about Christ's empathy and Christ having perfect empathy because of the atonement. And so Christ was able to, through descending below it all, through the atonement and through some miracle that we don't understand, was able to experience all our pain and all our suffering and all our sin, and to experience all of that. And therefore he has a perfect level of, or perfect ability to have empathy because of that. But I was thinking about it, that even in terms of the full extreme of that, like, and I'll use this extreme example, even though it is a little ridiculous, is, does Christ empathize with Satan? Is that included in the atonement? I don't know the answer to that. I would think not, though. But should he empathize with Satan? With Satan's pure hatred? Rather, if you took it even at a simpler level, like, should we empathize with people's sorrow? Sure. Should we empathize with people and mourn with those who mourn? To quote a scripture from the Book of Mormon. Yeah, absolutely. Should we bear one another's burdens? Yes. Should we empathize with hatred? Should we empathize with sexual perversion?
Okay, but I don't think I said at any point that empathy has to do those things. Empathy, again, if you have a strong moral compass and you have righteous empathy, you are not going to compromise your standards.
Right. Well, I'm not necessarily arguing against anything you said. I'm just making the point that empathy must be limited to good and useful things, to be good and useful.
It should have a righteous end in mind.
Well, and it should be based in righteous and caring about people's feelings that matter, rather than childish, satanic, evil feelings.
Yeah. So okay, and that's where I think it's being used so much against people today, because people want to have empathy. They want to have that Christ-like empathy if they come from that kind of a background, if they have strong Christian values at least, or have even a Christian background, a good moral background. So when they hear the term empathy and they hear it being used against them, or rather to guilt them into acceptance, I think that's the difference. I think that's what you're talking about as well.
Well, I think people like you and I respond that way. I think the broader problem is that there's a lot of people who are guilted into acceptance because they believe they need empathy.
Well, they believe that that's what empathy is.
Or they believe that's what empathy is.
Yes,
yeah.
But it's not. So it's not. You're exactly right. It's not that way.
Well, I think that from a certain point of view, empathy is that, though I absolutely agree with you when you say empathy is not a choice. Empathy is understanding. But once again, going back to what Paul Bloom said, using empathy as a moral compass is where the problem gets into play, because then it is using empathy to make a choice.
No, you have to have empathy. You have to have a good moral compass.
The moral compass
in order to exercise empathy properly.
Right. The moral compass that we need to be guided by is righteousness. It is that which is good. And I would define righteousness very specifically, first of all, by simply saying that it is God, that it is the will of God, it is the way of God, and it is God. God is righteousness. But God operates on principles as well, and those principles that God operates on are righteousness. We can understand that righteousness. We can understand those principles of righteousness to an extent, but only to an extent. We are flawed, imperfect, and frankly stupid beings, relatively speaking. And God is perfect and all-knowing and has no flaws in that regard. So God understands good and righteous in ways that we never can. So when a push comes to shove, we can make assessments of whether something is good or bad rationally to an extent without God, but only to an extent. And so the ultimate solution to any good choice is to turn to God and to have God dictate to us what is and isn't good and what is and isn't bad. But we can use our own judgment in that regards as well. The problem is that what we do is we step back and we say, if we take empathy as the moral compass, is we step back and we say, okay, how does this person feel about this? And then therefore, because they feel this way, we should act accordingly. And that totally takes out of the equation the potential.
Yeah, but that's not empathy. And that's what I think the confusion is today, is people think that is empathy, and that's not.
Well, no, it's using, that's what I said is it's using empathy. Like, you're using empathy to make the moral compass and to make the judgment, but it takes out of the equation that what people feel has no basis in good or bad. Like, it just has no bearing whatsoever on something being good or bad. Like, people can feel things that are really, really bad, and people can feel things that are really, really good. And they can feel extremely passionately about either of those things. And it has no bearing on right or wrong choices and what's good. And if you take it to the political sphere, even more so, then it has no bearing on what is going to be good for a country or good for the population. Is how the population feels about things. Like, that in and of itself, you get the standard Ben Shapiro line, facts don't care about your feelings. And I've seen kickback on that where people say, yeah, but feelings don't care about the facts. Both are true, right? But when you're talking about making policy, when you're talking about making good or bad decisions about how you progress in a country, in a city, in a home, in any organization, to take feelings into as the primary motivation for how things are guided, almost guarantees that you're gonna get off base. You're gonna be messed up, right?
So, yeah. So, let's go back a couple of steps here. So, in your discussion about Christ's ability to empathize with other people because of his atonement. And that's absolutely true. He did atone for us. He took upon him not just the sins of the world, but all the pains and sorrows of the world. Everything that mankind, humankind will suffer, has suffered and will suffer. And with that, he is able to guide us. And I think that's where the difference between the current worldly view of what empathy is and the more righteous view of what empathy is supposed to be differs. And that is that empathy is used in a way to help understand a person, but also then to be able to help that person in guiding them along the path that they should go. And that's what Christ does. He understands people's sorrow. He understands their pains. He understands even the sin that they go through, because he bore that pain of the sin. And then he's able to take that and then help. He doesn't say, and I agree with you. He says, okay, but let me show you a better way. When he sat and he dined with sinners, when he stayed with sinners, he was mocked and ridiculed, and they said, why do you do this? And he says, well, the physician or the healthy does not need a physician. I came here to administer to the poor and to the sick. And he didn't mean just physical ailments, obviously. He meant spiritual. And that's where his empathy is such a strength, because he does understand where they're coming from. But that's where he draws the line, and he says, but here is the better way. Here is what you should do. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And then he says, be like me. And what a hard thing to go through, but he does it in a very loving manner. And that's why earlier when I said empathy allows a person to create a common ground so that there is some sort of a common ground of understanding, and then a relationship of trust can be built, and then you help lead people along a better path, a righteous path.
So the only response I have to that specifically is that is only one theoretical path to leading people, and not always the right one.
Well, if you have somebody who is very hard-headed about good things, righteous things, they are going to have a very hard time getting people to trust them and believe that they are sincere. That's why I think that I didn't say everybody. I said some people. Now, you are going to
well, that's my point. That's the point I'm trying to get at, yeah.
But you are going to have people who are definitely going to look at that and say, no, I mean, that person thinks that he's above it all. That person thinks that he's too good. So they do not have that equal understanding or even mutual understanding between them. And you and I have been taught, when we taught other people about our church, is that having a relationship of trust was very important. And understanding what a person believes, even just what they believe, and then helping that person understand how that works in the overall scheme of things.
Right. But if you take the principle of trust, like if you take a child as an example, and the way that you interact with that child is only through the child's feelings and the child's interests and the child's, letting the child know that you understand them, validating that child, for example, as is a common approach to parenting in today's day and age. Are you building trust with that child? No. Like, what builds trust with a child is consistency, discipline, actually caring about the child, not just about the child's feelings. Now, obviously, caring about the child's feelings plays into that. It's not, you don't want to be, as you said at the beginning, you don't want to be cold to the child. You don't
the lack of love in a home will most assuredly result in a failed family relationship.
Right. But what is love? See, we get translated. This could be a whole podcast on its own. Love gets translated
love is
nowadays
an action verb.
as kindness.
Love is an action verb. I have to know it by seeing it.
Right. But it gets translated as kindness. And that is not what love is. Love is having what's best for the person at the forefront of your concern for them. You care what's best for them. Saying, I love you, therefore I'm not going to stop you from running out in front of this truck and getting squished by it because I love you and I don't want to make you cry and I don't want to hurt your feelings.
I'm not going to stop you from sleeping with your boyfriend or girlfriend.
Right.
I love you, so I'm going to put you on birth control. I love you, so just be careful when you do drugs. Just be careful when you drink with friends at a party.
I love you, so I'm not going to give you a curfew. I love you, so et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so these sorts of things are not always what love is. Love sometimes means taking the harsh stance. Sometimes means raising your voice. Sometimes means running and grabbing them, physically restraining them from doing something. Love can take all sorts of forms. Love is about your concern for their well-being and, frankly, for their eternal well-being more than it is about for their feelings.
If at some point in your child's life, if your child never tries to run away because they were upset about a decision that you made, then you did something wrong. You need to be a better parent.
Do you mean, I assume you mean run away, just like run from your grasp, not literally pack their bags and run away.
No, I mean like they're so upset about being disciplined that or being berated about something, being yelled at about something, that if they do not attempt to run away at some point, like I did several times in my childhood, just because I was upset about a decision that my parents made because they wouldn't let me do something, or they made me do something I didn't want to do. I think that if you have children that do that, you are doing a really good job at being a parent because you're making very tough decisions.
Did you? So I never did try and run away.
Your parents
I always
sucked then. Just kidding.
And my parents were no good.
No, I did.
Actually, my parents taught me explicitly that, you know, they sat down and talked to me about running away and taught me how it was a problem because of this, and, you know, where would I get food and how would I and it's just not the solution.
We didn't do that. I tried a couple of times. One of my brothers came in and he talked to me and talked me out of running away, but boy, and I don't even remember why. All I remember was I went into my room, I was so upset, and I started packing my bags. I always felt like the way that we portrayed
kids do
homeless
that, though,
people
to make
back then, which was a hobo. So the hobo, like with the stick and the little bandana with the little bit of whatever it was, and they tie it to the end of the stick. That's what I thought I would end up having to do. So I actually grabbed a stick and I grabbed a bandana.
You're going to go ride the rails.
Ride the rails. I'm going to walk along the railroad tracks and do that. But no, but it's just funny because you have situations today where a lot of children are being raised. We call it the snowflake generation, where they've been given participation trophies, where everybody is told they are right, that whatever they are feeling, they are right. And it's
and the root of that
is not love. But see, that is not love.
That is exactly the next point that I was going to make, which was we have this problem where we have been training people, we've been training children for decades now, that if others aren't empathetic with them, that's a problem, that's the world's bad, and there's a problem, and everybody needs to be empathetic with you.
I wouldn't use those words. What I would say is that if others don't agree with you, they don't have empathy towards you. I think that's what
they mean
saying.
The same thing, but they use
I think they're changing the words around so that now empathy becomes agreeing.
Yeah, I can't speak to that universally, obviously, because I don't know what words are used in all parenting households. I just know that it's common that we're taught that being validated. I mean, when you talk about like the participation trophy, what is that to protect? Why are they giving participation trophies to everyone? It's to protect feelings.
To protect feelings.
It's teaching. Yeah. It's teaching that feelings, your feelings, being validated and confirmed, and people empathizing with you, in other words, is what matters. That's what's important. If everybody isn't empathizing with you, then something's wrong, and you have to go fix it.
And in there, I would say, if not everybody is agreeing with you.
Well, I think as we've said, it amounts to that. It ends up amounting to that, which is, you know, I mean, I haven't put a ton of thought into that, so I'm not sure that I have a great answer to it, but it definitely, you know, maybe that's a whole nother podcast on its own of what it means to be everyone having to agree with you versus just empathizing with you. But we certainly see the results of that, right? You see the results of, you know, you have to be more empathetic to whatever group, whatever, you know, the latest trendy craze is of sin, that you have to be empathetic to that, which A, no, you don't. And then B, then that empathetic means that you also have to validate and accept and agree with it.
And agreement, I would say agree is being interchanged with empathy. So the two are getting mishmashed together when they shouldn't be.
But I don't think you even need to empathize with that. Like when those sorts of things go on, specifically I'm thinking of, you know, certain parades and that, like I can be compassionate towards it. I can allow it. I can have feelings of sympathy. I can have feelings of compassion towards. I can choose those sorts of responses. I can make efforts towards equality. I'll use that word carefully since you don't like equity.
Well, equity is equal outcome, and there's no way to assure equal outcome.
Look it up in the dictionary, man. I don't think that's the dictionary definition of equity.
That's what it's being used. Anyway, that's what it's being used as today, though. Equal outcome.
But the point is that I don't have to empathize with them to have those sorts of to make rational choices about how to be compassionate, how to be fair, how to let live, and those sorts of things. But that's not acceptable, and I'm treated now. I'm not a great I'm not a great example of empathy because I tend towards, on the scale of empathetic towards not empathetic, I definitely am on the not empathetic side of things naturally. And maybe that's why I've gone down these sorts of thought paths, is because I think to myself, I struggle with empathy. I struggle with when people feel certain ways or have certain emotional responses. I struggle with relating to that. Not all, in some ways I'm very emotional and I'm the guy who cries at Disney movies and stuff. Not anymore, but I used to cry at Disney movies before they started sickening me.
You still cry at the old ones, at the ones you used to cry at.
I cried at a Goofy movie. A Goofy
today,
movie
you still cry at the Goofy movie today?
I haven't seen it in long enough to say, so, but yeah, probably.
I cry at certain movies. Yeah, I cry at some of even the more recent Disney movies, and I'm talking about like within the last 10 years. I'm not talking about the ones in the last 2.
Right. Yeah.
Pirates of the Caribbean gets me every time.
But yeah, so maybe that's why, because I do struggle with
that one gets me. Herbie the Love Bug, the total near tearjerker. Now I'm mocking you.
Maybe that's why.
Now I'm mocking you. Sorry.
Maybe that's why I struggle a little bit with empathy, and maybe that's why I've gone down this path of thinking.
I wasn't being very empathetic about crying at Disney movies.
Is empathy requisite? Because I sit and I think, as much as I've striven for various things in my life, I fail and I fail and I fail and I fail, and I struggle and I struggle and I struggle and I struggle, and I don't know that I'll ever change in this life. I trust that someday I'll be perfected, but not before I die, most likely. I'm still going to be, in fact, in some ways we get worse at certain things. We become more curmudgeonly and more grumpy, grumpy old men syndrome. And I sit and I think, does that mean I'm doomed? Because I can't, when someone's crying on my couch because of something that I can't understand at all, and so I'm doomed because I have no empathy for them? Or can I still be compassionate to them? Can I still try my best to be helpful? Can I still make rational choices? I may not be able to, as you mentioned before, I may not be able to help certain personality types because of that. Like, because what they need is empathy and I can't give it to them. Okay, so they're going to not be able to get help from me in that situation, and hopefully someone else can help them. But then there are other people who what they really need is rational thinking and logical, reasoned out explanation of how to approach something. And in that case, hopefully, maybe this is thinking too high of myself, I would be useful and I would be able to actually be helpful to those people. Do either of those relate to the salvation of my soul, or more importantly, to the salvation of the world? And I just cannot help but think, no, choosing to be kind when kindness is required, choosing to be Christ-like, choosing to be obedient to God, choosing to be Christian in your values, and making the choices to, serve other people and help other people and be a good person is a rational choice that doesn't require you to feel the feelings of the poor souls. Like, you don't need complete. Now, if you're devoid of empathy, that might be harder. I don't know, but the point is, I think we do need general empathy, right? Like, generally, we can understand that, someone who doesn't have money, someone who doesn't have a job, someone who doesn't have health, someone who's sick, those sorts of things, that's hard. We've experienced being sick. We've experienced not having money. We've experienced losing a job. So you can generally have empathetic feelings towards those general ideas, and I think that's great, and we should. I don't think that's what I'm talking about. Some people may struggle even with that, though, but they still, despite that, they can make rational choices about good and bad. And particularly if they turn to God and follow God's will on that matter. God teaches us to serve our neighbor. God teaches us to give to the poor and the needy. God teaches us to, love one another and to treat each other with respect and to be kind to each other and these things. God gives us the means of being good despite how we may feel about it, and more importantly, whether or not we can connect our feelings with other people or not. You know what I mean?
So I kind of like the discussion about, and the points that are being made about standing, and this is why I made it an earlier comment about having a good moral compass, or at least a good foundation. A good foundation is going to allow you to help guide a person that needs some guidance without your own morals being compromised or your own values being compromised. If you don't have good intentions for other people, even if you have good intentions for other people, it does not mean that you have to agree, like we've been saying before. And I think that's something that's been really, we've now been told for the better part of several years that in order to empathize or have sympathy towards other people or understanding other people, that we have to agree with them. And if we don't agree with them, then we'll be canceled. When you have a good foundation, you can't be compromised. And I do agree that empathy ends when you see somebody doing something that is absolutely completely wrong. You're not required to empathize with that person. You know what that person is doing is wrong, or what they believe is wrong, or what they are saying is wrong. And you don't have to come to a common ground. But what you can say to that person is, I respect what you are saying because you have the right to say it. But you also need to understand that I have a right to say, believe, and feel the way that I feel.
Well, and I don't even know that that's absolutely true. In that when you say that you don't, we can't or shouldn't empathize at any level. I'm kind of flip flopping on what I'm saying here a little bit.
No, I'm saying it ends.
I'll clarify. I don't think it needs to end, is what I'm saying, though. Like, I think you can empathize to an extent with that, because one of the other things that we've all done is we've all sinned. We've all made mistakes. So we can understand, maybe not the specifics of their sin, but we can understand the temptation to do something that we shouldn't have done. We can understand the drive to be involved in things that we shouldn't have been involved in. And we can understand giving into those things and making those sorts of mistakes. And so the general idea of applying that we understand how people can be motivated and driven to make any given choice, to an extent, it can still be there and stuff, and can even be helpful. Like, going back to what you said, where it can be helpful. Like if you're trying to help someone out of sin and you have no comprehension of what it's like to sin, you know what I mean? Like,
well, everybody does, and if they're not, then
and everyone does, except Christ.
Yeah, exactly. So do you know?
But except Christ does understand it because he took the sins upon him.
Because he took the pain of it. Yes. Now, do you know who Jason Whitlock is?
I don't recognize the name immediately.
Okay, so Jason Whitlock.
I don't think I do.
Yeah, Jason Whitlock is part of the Blaze. He came on about a year ago, and he comes from the sports arena. He was a sports writer for newspapers. He knows an awful lot about sports. Let's just say that, and he knows an awful lot of very famous sports athletes and people in that industry. And one of the things that he has talked about many times is he'll see things like the LGBT movement, and he'll say absolutely, completely, it is wrong. He believes it is wrong, but then he also says that he's not going to condemn. He's very quick to not condemn, and the reason why he says it is because he himself for many years lived a life of sin, and he didn't feel like he had the authority to condemn. He felt like it would be very hypocritical to condemn, and I think that's a very good way of looking at.
Well, one of the things we often hear is that, hate the sin, love the sinner. We could replace that with. We could replace that word with condemn, meaning condemn
the sin, not the sinner. But see,
not the sinner. And it is not our place to condemn sinners, but we can absolutely take the concept of sin and say this is unacceptable.
And isn't it interesting,
particularly as a choice for me?
And isn't it interesting that those among us who condemn the sin are condemned by the sinners?
Well, that's going to be the natural reaction.
That is what happens today when you condemn the sin. Let's take the Phil Robertson situation from about 10 years ago, maybe a little less than 10 years ago. For example, he came out in a GQ interview and he talked about what his thoughts were on LGBT, the LGBT movement. And the only thing that Phil Robertson did was quote the New Testament and quote parts of the Bible. And in quoting that, his words got twisted around and he was then immediately condemned. So he used the words of the Bible to condemn the sin and then was immediately condemned as a person by the sinners. Right. And that's what I mean is where you have elements. You have very, very vocal elements of our society, outspoken elements, people who have the microphone, people who have the center stage. They are the ones who are able to capture audiences in the entertainment industry. And then they dictate what our moral compass should be, what our values should be, according to them.
It's all upside down.
Yeah, so they condemn.
What I was thinking is, when you get into situations where you do have a consensus on something being wrong, then that doesn't tend to be the case. And I'm not talking about illegal. I'm talking about things, because if it's illegal, that's a different issue, obviously. But I'm talking about, if you take something like smoking cigarettes, it's come to the point where the consensus is across the board that smoking cigarettes is bad for you. Which is essentially what we mean when we say sinful, right? Is bad for you and stuff. And you can have a conversation with someone who smokes, and you can talk about how smoking is bad for them, and you can talk about it in terms of, you do you, and I'm okay with you making your choice. It's not good for you. And there isn't that level of response. Like, people that smoke, I'm sure they have some level of irritation at people that are haughty and look down their nose at smoking. But good, because smoking's bad for them, right? But you know what I mean? Like, there's nowhere near the level. Like, if you came out and you talked about how smoking was bad for you, no one would, post a response video telling you what a bigot you were for talking about how bad smoking was.
30 years ago, that would have been very different.
30 years ago, they would have.
Yes.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was moving to. 30, 40 years ago, that would have. And 50 years ago, you couldn't even say that.
50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, doctors were giving it to kids. They were giving it to kids.
And so things change, but it's this effort to where the consensus is that certain things are not sinful. And it's really weird because I try to use that example if and when I can. It's like the fact that I think homosexuality is a sin is the same thing as thinking that smoking a cigarette is a sin. Like, if I have friends that smoked in the past, and I'd go out and I'd talk to them when they went on their smoke break, and I had no problem with the fact that they smoked, but I always thought I think smoking's literally a sin too, because the church we belong to teaches that smoking is a sin. So it's even beyond just thinking it's bad to you. And nobody's ever been offended and felt like I hated them because I thought smoking was a sinful choice. I was like, I'm okay with them smoking. I'm okay with them making that choice, but I think it's sinful. And the same is true of something like homosexuality, where I think it's sinful, but I've had friends that are homosexual. I have extended family that is homosexuality. I, have, one of my wife's cousins who's has that.
Yeah, we talked about that several times.
When we see him, I give him a big hug. We talk, or it's like there's no hatred there that I have towards him.
They're people too.
Yeah, but just because I think it's a sin, therefore I must hate him. It's just a ridiculous idea.
Do you remember this was given by a former president of our church, Gordon Hinckley. It was, I believe it was around 2001 or 2002. It was one of the general conferences, and this was during this was the Saturday evening session, so men only at the time. but he was talking specifically about homosexuality. I think it was 2002 because California was doing Proposition 8 at the time. And this was a month. Yep, and this was a month before that decision was made by the voters of California, who, if anybody is rusty on their history, Proposition 8 was to whether or not to legalize gay marriage in the state of California. And overwhelmingly, the people of California said, no, we don't want to legalize gay marriage within our state. And there was one judge of the Ninth Circuit Court, federal court in San Francisco, who overturned the will of the people in the state of California. When Gordon Hinckley was talking about homosexuality, he was very, very clear. Homosexuality is a sin. And I remember specifically how adamant he then became. So he was very adamant about homosexuality being a sin. And then he was very adamant about how we treat people who are homosexual. And it was almost like he flipped it immediately. So he was flipping the page was turned against homosexuality at that time. And then he immediately flipped and told the members of the church that in no way does that mean that we do not love people who are homosexual equally, that we still show an increase of love towards them, that's what Christ would want us to do. And that's what Christ
exercised. And we fight for them. Yeah, we fight for them as people. We don't necessarily fight for homosexual.
We don't fight for their cause.
Things, except we did, well, at a level, we did even fight for homosexual causes. I mean, depending on what you call a cause,
if people are going to
stood against.
Okay, if people are going to be mistreated,
we stood against homosexual. We stood against homosexual marriage, but we stood for homosexual rights as far as
civil rights,
the civil rights and the ability to not be discriminated against because of job or place or residence, different things like that.
People would say to that marriage is a civil right. Marriage is not a government institution. It is not part of the government. It should not be dictated by the government. Now, there were absolute legal civil ways to get around that in order for the same benefits of people who are homosexual.
Yeah, and that's even what the church stood for is for civil unions.
Absolutely, and they should still have been able to been given the right and recognized, so that they could have the same civil rights as people who are married who happen to be heterosexual, and that's where I think this whole thing came crashing down, where the government really started overstepping its bounds because they took something that they shouldn't have had their foot in, and they ruined that. So.
And that's a lot of people's opinion, is the government should just get out of marriage entirely.
They absolutely should. And so then that's really what started us down this road of where empathy now has ended up today. And that is, like we said before, empathy now, I believe, is being considered agreeing. In order to have empathy, you have to agree, you have to support, you have to now fight for that person's cause. It's no longer okay to say, look, you can believe what you want to believe. Now you have to actually champion it. You have to fight for it. Look what happened 2 years ago during the Summer of Love, right? Where they've got the peaceful demonstrations, and you had incredible numbers of people literally getting on their knees and apologizing for being white. And they succumbed, they appeased. And so in that sense, I really would even go with that term instead, is that empathy is appeasement. And in no way will appeasing ever solve uncomfortable situations.
Right. Well, and if you take that as an example, use race as an example, where we should absolutely have empathy there. Empathy towards the situation of someone who struggles because of their race.
Empathy in a righteous manner.
but to use simply the feeling of sorrow for that situation as the guidance for policy and decision making and the way that you interact is not necessarily the best choice, and not necessarily the thing that's going to be the most helpful or even work or even make sense. See, like the whole idea of reparations, where it's like reparations is a feel-good idea, but in practicality, it makes no logical sense.
It's not empathy.
Like who's paying reparations to who, and how is that going to work, and how long does it go on, and how it's
how
it's
does
just like
paying
it's kind of a mess of an idea.
reparations to somebody that lives today that did not experience what was experienced 150 years ago?
Well, and the people living today
who are paying it had nothing to do.
Didn't have anything to do with
committing
it and had no
those
experience
things.
with it. Yeah, exactly. And so it makes no sense. So it's a feel-good idea
So
based on empathy,
it does
but
nothing.
it doesn't
All
actually
it
make
is,
any sense.
It's just redistribution
anyway,
of wealth. Yeah.
So I think, it's a little bit of a controversial position to take. Empathy being a potentially negative thing, but let us know in the comments what you think. Tell us if you think we're full of it. Obviously, we didn't agree on everything either. And I think it's a really interesting discussion either way, and to consider how these sorts of, this is why I wanted to talk about it, to consider how these sorts of things are affecting the way that society's turning and how useful, what sort of things are useful. Compassion, obviously. Sympathy.
Kindness.
I guess I don't know what sympathy is.
Kindness, love.
Empathy. Nobody knows what empathy is.
Nope, we don't. We still don't know what empathy is.
We still don't know what empathy is. One of the things Paul Bloom said too is if you talk to 20 different psychiatrists or psychologists, you'll get 20 different answers as to what empathy is. And so
yes,
it's a little bit of a problem there. But
be kind.
Anyway, let us know what you think in the comments.
Be kind and have courage.
Yep. And feel free to subscribe if you enjoy our content. And like, dislike, whatever you like. We'd love the interaction. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for being with us.